The scent of antiseptic lingered in the corridors of NobleCare's private research hospital, a quiet monument to wealth and medicine. At 11:47 p.m., long after doctors had gone home and the halls had fallen silent, Grace Miller pushed her cleaning cart down the executive wing, her worn sneakers barely making a sound on the polished marble floor. She was 33, with soft eyes that held more fatigue than age. Her brown hair was tied back in a messy bun, and her oversized gray uniform hung loosely on her small frame. Each night she cleaned the same offices and labs without a word invisible to the people in white coats and black suits. This night, however, something was different. Grace reached for the next room on her schedule. The key card granted access, and the heavy door clicked open. Inside, the lights were dimmed low. The room didn't look like an office, it felt more like a suite. Curtains were drawn over the windows, medical machines blinked softly, and in the center of the room was a hospital bed. Grace paused. On the bed lay a boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old, with chestnut curls and pale skin. He didn't move. His eyes were open, unfocused, staring at the ceiling. Tubes and wires trailed from his arms and chest to machines that monitored everything except hope. She stepped back instinctively, about to close the door, but something made her stop. Maybe it was the way the boy's hand was curled slightly toward his chest. Or maybe it was the too familiar stillness, the kind that reminded her of her own son's quiet nights, the way he would wait for her voice before sleep. Grace hesitated, then gently pushed the cart aside. She stepped inside, careful not to make a sound, and sat on the couch in the corner. She didn't touch anything, just sat. Minutes passed. Then softly, barely above a whisper, she said, "Hi there." No reaction, not even a blink. "I'm Grace," she continued, unsure why. "I'm just here to clean, but I used to read bedtime stories to my little boy. He was scared of the dark. Maybe you're scared too." Still silence. She looked at the bookshelf in the corner. There was a worn copy of Winnie the Pooh. She stood up, took the book gently, and sat again. "Would you mind if I read a little?" she asked. She opened the book. Her voice was low and warm, shaped by years of motherhood and sorrow. She didn't rush. She just read. After 10 minutes, she glanced up, still no change. But something about the room felt less hollow. She finished the chapter, placed the book back, and stood. "Good night, little one," she whispered. And as she turned to go, her heart pulled at her as if asking her not to leave him alone. She didn't know that behind a one-way observation window, a security camera blinked red, or that the boy in the bed was Max Blake, son of the powerful Ethan Blake, CEO of the NobleCare empire, or that the next time she entered that room, something would stir that hadn't moved in months. Tonight, Grace was just a mother who spoke into silence, and somehow that silence had listened. The next night, Grace hesitated at the same door. Her keycard trembled slightly in her hand, unsure if she was about to overstep. But curiosity, or maybe something deeper, urged her to swipe again. The soft click welcomed her back into the silent room. Max lay exactly as before, his body still and delicate like porcelain. His chest rose and fell with the assistance of machines, but there was no spark behind his eyes. Grace wheeled her cart inside, parked it neatly in the corner, and glanced again at the bookshelf. Tonight she chose The Velveteen Rabbit. She pulled up the chair beside his bed, this time closer than yesterday, careful to respect the stillness, but unwilling to let it define the room. She opened the book and began. Her voice was low, gentle, seasoned by loss and motherly instinct. She didn't rush through the pages. Each word seemed to settle in the air like dust hanging between them. The rabbit sighed. He thought it would be a long time before this magic called real happened to him. She smiled to herself. "I know that feeling," she said softly, her fingers gripping the spine of the book. "Waiting for something to make you feel whole again. Her mind drifted briefly to her own son, Aiden. He was 7 now, once bright and full of questions until a car accident left him withdrawn, barely speaking to anyone except her. She had tried everything, doctor's therapy, but the one thing that seemed to work was her voice, her touch, her presence. That's what brought her to this job. She couldn't afford more treatments, but she could afford to clean. And maybe she could offer the smallest piece of peace to another child lost in silence. She read for 20 minutes. Then just before she closed the book, she noticed something. It was subtle. A flicker. Max's eyelid twitched. She froze, leaned forward. "Max," she whispered. No response. She waited. 10 seconds. 20. His fingers shifted barely a slight curl inward, so small it could have been imagined. But Grace didn't imagine things like that. She had trained for this once. She knew what micro-responses looked like. And more than that, she felt it. A pulse of something invisible and sacred passing between them. She reached forward and placed the book gently on the table. Then she leaned closer and whispered, "You're not alone. I'll be back tomorrow." When she stepped out of the room, she expected someone to stop her security. A nurse, someone accusing her of breaking protocol. But the hallway was empty, just humming lights and polished floors. What she didn't know was that in the building across the courtyard, in an executive suite, on the 14th floor, Ethan Blake sat in front of a monitor rewinding the camera feed, watching the moment Max's hand moved. He leaned forward, hands clasped, eyes sharp. "Who are you?" he muttered, staring at the cleaning woman on the screen. The next night he would be waiting, and he would finally begin to understand that the quiet woman in the gray uniform was not just cleaning dust from his empire. She was stirring life back into his son's world. Ethan Blake hadn't slept in 2 nights. Not because of board meetings or deadlines, but because of the camera feed on his office monitor, the one he kept replaying over and over. He had watched the cleaning woman sit beside his son read stories, speak in a voice so gentle it could calm a storm. And then, there it was again. Max's fingers twitched. He leaned closer, each time he watched it frame by frame, just to confirm he wasn't hallucinating. He wasn't. Ethan was a man of logic, numbers, and control. A self-made billionaire, he had built the Noble Care empire from a single rehabilitation clinic into a global network of elite hospitals. He had no room for hope that wasn't backed by science. And yet here he was, staring at a janitor making progress where an army of neurologists had failed. He rubbed his hands over his face. The rational part of him screamed that this was coincidence, a muscular reflex. But a quieter voice whispered, "What if it's not?" That night he arrived at the hospital early. Instead of his usual penthouse residence, he stayed in the shadows of the East Wing, one hallway over from the executive pediatric unit. He kept the lights off and waited. At 11:50 p.m., she came. Grace walked with the same quiet composure as always. No makeup, no fanfare. She nodded politely to the security guard, pushed her cart down the hallway, and disappeared into Max's room. Ethan stepped silently behind the one-way glass, the observation window built into the wall for medical staff. He watched her pause at the door, look toward his son with a softness that startled him, and then enter. Like someone returning to visit family. She didn't rush to clean. Instead, she sat, picked up another book. Tonight she chose Charlotte's Web. Her voice wrapped around the room like warmth on a winter morning. It had no agenda, no strategy, just sincerity. She didn't know she was being watched. That made it real. Max remained still. But halfway through the second chapter, Ethan saw it again. A small tremble in his son's lips. Barely noticeable, but there. Grace kept reading, unaware of the CEO just 10 feet away, holding his breath. Ethan had spent millions on treatments. Specialists from Switzerland. Cutting-edge tech from Japan. Experimental therapies. None had produced what he just saw. When she finished reading, Grace stood and gently tucked the blanket around Max's legs. "You're not invisible, sweetheart," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "I see you. I believe you're still here." Then she did something that made Ethan's throat tighten. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small crocheted rabbit, faded, clearly handmade. She placed it beside Max's hand. "My son has one just like this," she murmured. "He calls it Brave Bunny. I thought maybe you could borrow his tonight." Then she left. Ethan stood frozen. She had said my son. She was a mother. That explained something he couldn't name: an instinct in her voice, a rhythm in her compassion. Not clinical, maternal. As the door clicked shut behind her, Ethan finally exhaled. He walked into Max's room and approached the bed, eyes locked on his son. "Max," he said, voice cracking, "are you still in there?" Max didn't move, but the rabbit remained nestled near his fingers. Ethan sank into the visitor's chair, staring at the soft toy and the faint ghost of hope that now haunted the air. He didn't know Grace Miller's name yet, but tonight he made a decision. He would find out exactly who she was, and why in a building full of experts the only person reaching his son was the woman hired to mop the floors. The next morning, Ethan sat at his desk long before sunrise, staring at a folder the head of security had dropped off an hour earlier. Inside were printed pages of Grace Miller's employment file, pulled from the janitorial contractor's database. It wasn't much. Name: Grace Evelyn Miller, age 33, position night cleaning crew. Start date 6 months ago. No disciplinary actions address, Southridge Apartments, Unit 14B, but that wasn't enough for Ethan. He needed to know who she really was, why her voice seemed to reach Max when no one else could. He had people to find answers. By noon, he had them. She had once been something else entirely. Grace had enrolled in a graduate program for speech and neurocognitive therapy at the University of Michigan on a full scholarship. Professors noted her brilliance and empathy, calling her a natural communicator with a healing presence. But halfway through her first year, her husband, Sergeant Daniel Miller, was killed during a peacekeeping mission overseas. Grace had dropped out the following month with a newborn son in her arms and grief too heavy to carry both school and motherhood. Since then, she'd never returned to academia. She bounced between jobs: receptionist, daycare worker, cashier, never staying long, always prioritizing her son's needs over her own ambition. Medical records showed that her son Aiden had been in a car accident at age 5 and suffered trauma-induced selective mutism. Grace had tried every therapy available until her insurance ran out. That's when she started cleaning at Noble Care. The hospital couldn't treat her son for free, but it could pay her to scrub its floors. Ethan leaned back in his chair, silent. She had walked away from everything, not out of failure, but love. And now she was showing up in his son's life like a ghost from a forgotten world, bringing with her something no doctor on his payroll had been able to deliver: connection. That evening he waited for her. Grace didn't notice him at first. She arrived on time as always, her cart neatly packed, her steps quiet. But as she turned the corner toward Max's room, she stopped. Ethan stood outside, arms crossed, face unreadable. She hesitated. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "If I've done something wrong, You haven't," he interrupted. She looked up, surprised. "Oh, then, may I ask why you're here?" He nodded toward the door. "That's my son." Grace's eyes widened and something shifted in her posture. "I didn't know," she said softly. "I never meant to." "I watched the footage," Ethan said. "The camera in the room. I've seen you with him." She swallowed, her throat dry. "I didn't mean to overstep. I know I'm not part of the care team." He paused. "Why did you read to him?" Her answer came without hesitation. "Because no one else was, and because he looked like he needed someone to remember he's still human." For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. Then he asked, "What do you see when you look at him?" Grace looked toward the door. "I see a little boy who's not ready to say goodbye." Ethan nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. Will you keep reading to him? Grace blinked. I want you to do whatever it is you're doing that's making my son react again, he said. I don't care if it's magic science or mother's instinct. It's working. She smiled for the first time. That night, for the first time since Max's accident, Ethan stayed in the room while Grace read. He didn't interrupt, didn't speak. He just sat in the chair across the room watching, as her voice brought warmth into a space that had known only silence. Grace didn't expect him to be waiting the next night, but there he was again, outside Max's room wearing a suit and an expression too serious to ignore. The air felt heavy, like something important was about to be said. Ethan stepped aside and motioned for her to enter. She did so without a word, quietly placing her cart in the hallway and walking into the now familiar space. Max lay as he always did, silent, eyes open, but distant. Tonight, Grace didn't reach for a book. She turned to face Ethan. You've seen the changes, she asked carefully. He nodded once. Subtle, but real. She looked back at Max. Sometimes subtle is all we get before it becomes something bigger. There was a pause. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, eyes fixed on his son. You're not certified anymore. You're not licensed. You're not part of his care team. You're a janitor. Grace didn't flinch. I know. Then why are you doing this? He asked. You know you could be sued, fired, accused of trespassing. She held his gaze. Because I know what it feels like to have a child you love disappear in front of you. And because if my voice, even just for a few minutes, makes Max feel less alone, I'll risk all of that. Her voice was firm, but her hands were shaking slightly. She wasn't used to defending herself, especially not to men in $1,000 suits. Ethan's jaw tightened. Do you think you're curing him? No, she said softly. I think I'm reminding him he still matters. He didn't speak right away. He walked over to the side of Max's bed and sat down, staring at the boy's still face. Then he looked up at her. You said your son went through something similar. She nodded. Car accident. He stopped speaking. Not physically paralyzed, but emotionally locked away. No one could reach him. Until I did. With your voice? Not just that, with love, patience, presence. Ethan looked back at Max. And you think that's enough? Grace stepped closer. I think it's more than what he's getting now. For a moment, silence filled the room again. Not cold or clinical, but reflective. Then Ethan stood and walked toward her close enough that she could see the tired lines under his eyes. You have 5 minutes a night, he said, inside this room, on one condition. She raised an eyebrow, which is no books, no toys, just you, just your voice. Grace blinked, surprised. You trust me that much? No, he said, but I trust what I saw in my son's eyes after you left. She smiled faintly. Deal. And just like that, she sat beside Max again, no book in hand, no props, only her voice and her heart. I don't know if you remember me, she whispered to Max, but I'm back, and I'm not going anywhere. Ethan watched from across the room. He still didn't believe in miracles, but for the first time in 6 months, he believed in possibility. And sometimes that was the beginning of everything. The days that followed settled into an unexpected rhythm. Grace would arrive just before midnight, push her cart past the security desk, and step into Max's room with a softness that felt sacred. Ethan, though rarely inside, always found a reason to linger nearby. Some nights he stayed just outside the glass, pretending to read emails while secretly listening. Other nights he stood in the shadows behind the curtain, arms folded, silent witness to something no doctor could chart on a monitor. Grace spoke to Max the way a mother speaks to a sleeping child she believes can hear her. She didn't ask him to wake up. She didn't plead. She just told stories. Sometimes they were about her son Aiden. Sometimes they were made up about dragons who got lost in cities or lonely stars who missed their home. Always her tone was gentle, filled with pauses, that felt like room for Max to breathe. One night she brought a harmonica. "I'm not good at this," she said with a smile, placing it gently in her lap. "But Aiden used to laugh when I tried." She played a few off-key notes, then chuckled at herself. "See, terrible. But it's not about being perfect, it's about trying." Max didn't move. She leaned forward. "I know you're trying too, even if it doesn't show yet." Then for the first time he blinked. Ethan gasped softly from behind the curtain. He hadn't imagined it. Max's eyes had shifted not much but enough to follow the sound of her voice. Grace didn't stop. She kept talking, told a silly story about a boy who trained a group of ants to do his homework. And as she did, Max's hand resting near the stuffed rabbit curled inward slightly. She froze mid-sentence. "Max," she whispered. His lips twitched. Grace put a hand over her heart, blinking back tears. "You hear me? You really hear me." The next morning, Ethan called in every specialist. Neurologists ran fresh tests. MRIs were reviewed, electrodes reapplied. All they could confirm was that Max was showing new activity. Brain scans lit up differently. His eyelids responded to stimuli. One doctor called it inexplicable progression, but Ethan knew what had changed. Or rather, who. Later that evening, as Grace prepared to leave, Ethan caught up with her near the exit. "Tonight," he said, his voice tight with emotion. He responded. Grace's smile was quiet, not triumphant. "I saw it." "How did you know?" he asked. "How did you know this would happen?" She shook her head gently. "I didn't, but I believed it could." They stood in silence for a moment, the kind that comes when disbelief meets gratitude. "You gave him back something none of us could," Ethan said finally. "No," she corrected. He took the step. "I was just here to catch it when he did." He looked at her for a long moment, then asked, "Would you consider spending more time with him?" "Not just 5 minutes." Her breath caught. "Are you serious?" "Yes, officially. On the payroll. As whatever title you want, I'll create one if I have to." Grace hesitated. "I'd have to reduce my hours. Cleaning isn't optional for me." "I'll cover everything," he said, almost impatiently. "This isn't charity. It's hope. And I don't care how it comes through credentials or kindness." Grace looked away, her voice softer. "I'd need time off for my son. Aiden, he still needs me." Ethan nodded. "Bring him. We'll make it work." She stared at him, unsure how to process the sudden shift from invisible to indispensable. Then she whispered, "Okay." That night when she returned to Max's room, she didn't bring a book or a harmonica, just her voice and a single sentence that reached deeper than any medicine ever could. "You're not alone anymore." And from across the room, Ethan watched as his son's fingers moved again, this time without doubt. Ethan should have seen it coming. The moment Hope returned to his son's room, the wolves began to circle outside it. At the Monday board meeting, the mood was colder than usual. 12 executives sat around the mahogany table, their suits sharp and their smiles thinner than paper. Ethan arrived 10 minutes early, his tie undone and coffee in hand, more father than CEO these days. He barely finished his second sip before Thomas Vance, the chief operating officer, cleared his throat. "Ethan," Thomas said too politely, "we need to talk about the woman." Ethan's jaw tightened. "What woman?" "The janitor. Grace Miller." "She's not a janitor anymore," Ethan replied. "She's part of Max's recovery." "That's the problem," said one of the directors. "You've given a non-medical contractor direct access to a high-risk patient, your own son, no less. Do you understand the legal implications?" Ethan didn't flinch. "She's not administering medication. She's speaking to him, and he's responding." "We've reviewed the footage," Thomas said. "The board is unanimous. This isn't protocol. It's emotional improvisation." "She's done more than your entire neuroscience team," Ethan snapped. Thomas leaned forward. "Then put her on a trial, run evaluations, get third-party confirmation. But until then, we recommend she cease all interaction with Max." Ethan rose to his feet. "You don't recommend. You're trying to overrule me." "No," Thomas said calmly. "We're trying to protect the company. And if you continue to blur personal and professional lines, Noble Care will suffer. Behind the suits and polished arguments, Ethan saw it clearly. Some of them didn't care about Max. They saw this as a PR risk, a liability, or worse, an emotional weakness from a CEO who had gone soft. "I'll take it under consideration," Ethan said, voice like ice. The meeting ended. He didn't speak to anyone on his way out. That evening, he paced outside Max's room, while Grace sat beside the boy, unaware of what had happened hours earlier. Her voice filled the hallway, like always steady, warm, unwavering. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the board was already moving behind the scenes. The next morning, his legal counsel confirmed it. Grace's access badge had been flagged. HR was quietly preparing paperwork. The board had set an ultimatum: suspend the unauthorized engagement, or they would call for a vote of no confidence. He stared at the message for a long time. He had built this empire. He had sacrificed decades to make it the best in the field. But now the system he created was rejecting the very thing saving his son. That night, Grace arrived as usual, but Ethan stopped her outside the door. She saw it instantly in his face. "What is it?" He hesitated, then looked away. "The board doesn't want you here anymore." Grace nodded slowly. "I figured it was too good to last. I tried to stop them." "It's okay," she said, voice low. "He's your son. Not mine." "No," Ethan said sharply. "You're part of his story now, whether they like it or not." Grace placed her hand on the doorframe. "If this is goodbye, let me say one last thing to him." Ethan nodded. Inside, she approached Max's bed with trembling hands. "I won't be here tomorrow," she whispered. "But I'll be thinking of you every single night. You're stronger than they know, and I believe in you." She kissed his forehead, then walked past Ethan without another word. The door closed behind her like the end of a chapter, and as Ethan stood there alone beside his son, he realized something terrifying. Max had started to return to life, but without Grace, he might disappear again. Days passed, and the silence returned. Not just in Max's room, but inside Ethan's chest. The small progress, those twitches, eye movements, finger curls began to fade like a dream he had clutched too tightly. Max's vitals remained stable, but the spark was gone. His eyes returned to that distant, unblinking stare. His hand, once curled near the rabbit, now lay flat again. Doctors offered explanations: neural fatigue, inconsistency in recovery, nothing to worry about. But Ethan knew better. Grace was gone, and with her something intangible had left the room. He tried everything. Brought in a music therapist, hired a world-renowned child psychologist, even played the same books Grace had read aloud, voiced by actors with soothing tones. Max didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He simply withdrew. Ethan stood beside the hospital bed one night, staring at his son's pale face. "I thought we were getting him back," he whispered, gripping the rail. "I thought I was doing everything right." He hadn't called Grace. Part of him feared that if he did, it would only make things worse, that he'd have to admit the board had won, that he had failed not just as a CEO, but as a father. But that night, while scrolling aimlessly through hospital case notes, he stumbled across the old security footage again. There she was, sitting in the corner, humming off key on the harmonica, laughing softly. His throat tightened. He picked up his phone. Southridge Apartments was nothing like Ethan's world. The hallways smelled of dust and old laundry. Children's voices echoed through thin walls. Ethan knocked on Unit 14B with hesitation in his hand. Grace answered in a faded t-shirt and sweatpants, her hair tied back, a dish towel over her shoulder. For a moment, she simply stared. "Mr. Blake." He cleared his throat. "Ethan, please." She stepped aside, letting him in. The apartment was modest but warm, books on the shelves, children's drawings taped to the fridge. "I'm sorry to show up like this," he said, "but I didn't know where else to go." "What happened?" she asked, voice softening. "It's Max," he said. "He's slipping again since you left." She closed her eyes for a moment. I thought he might. Ethan looked toward the hallway. A small boy peeked from behind the corner, a mirror image of Max at a glance. Dark eyes, guarded expression. That's Aiden, Ethan asked. Grace nodded. He doesn't like strangers. I get that, Ethan said. Neither does my son. Or didn't. Until you. She turned toward him. I can't go back, Ethan. The board made it clear. I'm not a therapist. I don't have a license. I'm just a mother who used to believe in healing. That's not enough for your world. It was enough for my son, Ethan said quietly. I think it still is. Grace studied him for a long time. And what about the board? I've stopped listening to people who think healing comes only in white coats. She smiled a little sad. Why now? Because Max needs you, he said. And I think, so do I. She looked toward Aiden, who had crept a little closer, drawn by the unfamiliar voice. Come with me, Ethan said. Both of you. Tomorrow. Is this a job offer? She asked. No, he said. It's a chance. For him, for Max, for all of us. Grace didn't say yes right away. She simply turned to Aiden and knelt beside him, brushing a hand through his hair. Would you like to visit a boy who needs a friend? She asked. Aiden nodded, and just like that, Grace agreed. The next day she would return not as a cleaner, not as a miracle, but simply as herself. And for Max, that might be the one thing strong enough to bring him back. Max's room felt colder than before. The warmth that Grace had unknowingly carried with her seemed to have vanished with her departure, replaced by an eerie stillness that even Ethan couldn't break. Machines beeped softly, nurses moved in and out on routine checks, but none dared speak in the hushed space. Then the door opened, and the light shifted. Grace stepped inside. She wasn't in uniform anymore, just a soft green cardigan and jeans. Behind her, holding tightly to her hand, was Aiden. His eyes scanned the room cautiously. But Grace gave him a gentle nod of reassurance. Ethan rose from the chair, something in his chest unlocking as he saw them. Grace said nothing at first. She approached the bed like she always did, with reverence. Her hand reached for Max's blanket, smoothing it gently as she whispered, "Hey there, I'm back." There was no visible response, but she kept talking. "I missed you," she said softly. "I've been thinking about that rabbit of yours. Brave bunny, remember? He's still got stories to tell." She turned to Aiden and gave him a look. The boy hesitated, then stepped forward and placed something on Max's nightstand. A harmonica. Ethan's eyes widened slightly. "I told Max about your playing," Grace said. "Would you like to show him?" Aiden's hands trembled. He looked at the boy in the bed, then at his mother. Grace knelt beside him and whispered, "Just one song. The one we practiced." With uncertain fingers, Aiden lifted the harmonica to his lips and blew gently. The notes came out wobbly, not perfect, but filled the room with something real, something fragile and alive. Max didn't move. But as the last note faded, Grace stepped forward again. "You're not alone, Max," she said, her voice firm but kind. "I'm here. He's here. We're all waiting." Then she leaned close to his ear. "And I know you hear me." A long moment passed. Then Max's eyelids fluttered. Grace gasped. Ethan stood up so fast his chair toppled backward. Max's lips parted. A breath rough and faint pushed through. His fingers twitched again, stronger this time, reaching toward the stuffed rabbit by his side. "Max," Grace said, tears filling her eyes. His mouth moved slow and unsure. "Ma." The syllable was barely audible, but it broke something wide open in Ethan's chest. "Try again?" Grace encouraged, clutching his hand gently. "Ma. Ma." And then it came, clear, small, but unmistakable. "Mom." Ethan froze. Grace blinked. Neither spoke. Max turned his eyes slowly, painfully toward Grace. "Mom," he whispered again. Grace bit her lip hard. "I'm not your mom, sweetheart. But I'm here." Max's brow furrowed in confusion, and a tear slipped from the corner of his eye. Ethan stepped forward, overwhelmed. "Max," he said softly, "I'm here too." The boy turned his head again, this time toward his father. His expression was weak but aware. Dad Ethan dropped to his knees beside the bed. "Yes, son. Yes. I'm here." Max blinked slowly. His lips parted again, but this time he just breathed. And for the first time in nearly 7 months, that breath wasn't empty. It was connected. It was alive. Grace pulled Aiden into her arms. The boy buried his face in her sweater, not understanding everything but sensing the shift, the relief, the miracle. Doctors would later call it spontaneous cognitive return, neurological unpredictability, a case study. But in that moment for Ethan and Grace, it wasn't science. It was something far more human. Connection, hope, and the sound of a little boy remembering the world because someone believed he could. 3 weeks later, the hospital wing didn't feel like a hospital anymore. The fluorescent lights had been softened. The monitors still blinked, but their sounds were gentler now, more like background music than alarms. Max sat propped up in bed with a sketch pad on his lap, drawing something that looked like a spaceship flying over a field of stars. Aiden sat beside him, scribbling his own messy picture of a dragon with 3 heads. Ethan stood just outside the doorway, watching them through the glass with a coffee in hand and disbelief still written across his face. "Is this real?" He whispered more to himself than anyone else. "It is," Grace said quietly beside him. He looked at her. Her presence had become as natural now as the beeping of monitors or the late-night hallway strolls. She no longer wore hospital badges or pushed carts. She walked in and out freely because Max asked for her by name every day. Grace had been offered a new role, of course. Ethan insisted. But she refused to be called anything official. No title, no desk, just Grace. Still, her influence had rippled far beyond that room. The board had tried to push back at first, threatened lawsuits, questioned ethics, but none of them could argue with results. Max's recovery had been featured in medical journals, not for the methods used, but for the fact that against all logic, he had begun to heal when someone simply believed in him. That, as one journalist wrote, was not a medical breakthrough but a human one. "You should be in there," Ethan said, glancing at Grace. "You helped bring him back." She smiled. "I don't want to interrupt. This is his time now." He nodded slowly, then hesitated. "And what about your son? How's Aiden adjusting?" "He still doesn't say much," she said. "But he smiles now. Especially around Max. He's never had a friend before who understands." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the boys laugh together through the glass. 2 quiet souls who had found comfort in one another, without needing many words. Then Ethan turned to her, more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already did," she said. "I mean it. You gave me back my son." Grace looked down. "No. Max came back because he chose to. I just made sure he wasn't alone while he decided." Ethan took a breath. "Well, you didn't just change Max's life." Grace looked at him. "You changed mine." The words weren't grand or poetic. They were simple, true. She didn't respond right away. Then finally she said, "You were the first person who saw me as more than a cleaning lady." "You were never just a cleaning lady," he replied. "You were the answer I didn't know I was praying for." He hesitated, then asked, "What would you think about staying on long term? For Max? For Aiden? For us?" Her eyebrows lifted. "Us," he looked suddenly unsure. "Too soon," she chuckled. "Maybe, but not unwelcome." A light knock at the glass interrupted them. Max waved at them both. His smile, though still faint from fatigue, was real. Aiden stood next to him, holding up a drawing. It showed 4 stick figures, 2 adults and 2 kids, all holding hands. Ethan stared. "So that's us now?" he asked, lips curling into a smile. Grace nodded. "Looks like it." The door opened and the 2 children's laughter spilled into the hallway, pulling the adults back inside, not into duty, but into belonging. And as the four of them sat together, Ethan, Grace, Max, and Aiden, the room no longer felt like a recovery suite. It felt like the beginning of a family. A strange one, perhaps. But sometimes the best stories start not with perfect plans, but with a voice that dared to speak when the world had gone quiet.